what the pause in the Chinese tariffs means for supply chains, how shippers are planning their next 3 months, and remote job opportunities in logistics. Pull up a chair and join us as the editors of DC Velocity discuss these stories as well as news and supply chain trends on this week's Logistics Matters podcast. I am Dave Maloney. I'm the Group Editorial Director at DC Velocity. Welcome. Logistics Matters is sponsored by Cardex. AutoStore, empowered by Cardex, offers the fastest order fulfillment system per square foot. Cardex's intuitive picking assistant and Fulfill X software optimize AutoStore, providing customers with unmatched storage density, inventory accuracy, and operator efficiency for maximum ROI. When you think AutoStore, think Cardex. Find out more at cardex.com. As usual, our DC Velocity senior editors Ben Ames and Victoria Kickham will be along to provide their insights into the top stories of this week. But to begin today, we now have a pause in tariffs with China, at least a sizable reduction in the amount of those tariffs compared to what was in place just a couple of weeks ago in the ongoing tariff wars. So how are supply chains reacting, and where do we go from here? To find out, we welcome back today's guest. John Lash is Group Vice President of Strategy at e2open. Welcome back, John. It's good to have you again with us on Logistics Matters.
Thanks, David. It's always great to be here. I appreciate being invited back.
Our pleasure. Could you share a bit about your company and its role in the supply chain industry?
Sure. We help companies understand what to make, move, and sell. And this encompasses everything from planning demand and supply to sourcing, production, transportation across all modes, global trade, supplier management, distribution management through retailers and distributors. So kind of think of that from an end-to-end perspective. And, we're also a large, if not the largest global trade management provider in the market, which is kind of a hot topic these days. Why we're talking today.
It certainly is. And of course, we're here to talk about the pause in the Chinese and U.S. tariffs going back and forth. They've negotiated that 90-day pause in the tariff war. Can you share how supply chains are reacting so far to this?
Yeah, I think supply chains are reacting with, I guess it's best to say, a sense of relief. Everyone's rushing to get orders in before the window closes for shipments from China, as not to have empty shelves or idle production lines. It's kind of like a floodgate was lifted. And it's not just from goods from China, but from other countries too. Remember, China's 90-day pause expires on August 10th, but the 90-day pause on reciprocal tariffs expires on July 8th, which is affecting imports from Vietnam, India, Cambodia, and adding an additional 27 to 49% tariff rates. And despite this temporary sense and relief with the 90-day pauses, this on-again, off-again policy for tariffs is essentially whipsawing supply chains. Demand's up and then it's down. Production is on and then it's off. Transport is feast or famine. It's really disruptive. And these wild swings in duty rates, they're putting supply assurance at risk. And the last time we saw a threat like this to supply assurance was in the pandemic. But this time it's man-made.
Yeah, and of course, we need to mention that while there's a pause, it doesn't mean that all the tariffs have been eliminated. We should still expect to see some price increases, or at least those tariffs affecting prices, I would think.
Yeah, tariffs are they're 30% for China during this reprieve, down from a whopping 145%. And at 145%, the market essentially collapses. And while it's a great relief, it's important to recognize that 30% is still high. Like it's higher than the duty rates last year. And to put a scale on the tariffs, right, to put some context around that, companies dedicate a lot of time managing costs and really concerned about inflationary pressures of 3 to 4% and raising those as red flags. This is 30%, right? So that's like 8 to 10 times that amount that they're worried about in the day-to-day side from inflationary side. So these tariffs are in a completely different league. And even at 30%, we should be expecting prices to rise. The hardest hit are going to be retailers selling finished goods that are imported from China, but it also impacts goods made in America that rely on imported production inputs. And in the case of retailers, margins are thin, right? So they can't absorb the 30% rise, let alone 145%. So who pays? Well, the consumer, because eventually everything flows downhill. And we should also look for rising costs and inflationary pressures and, a general slowdown in GDP. And we're already seeing concerns in the bond market and a rise in the cost of money. So it's just overall, it's getting more expensive.
Right. And of course, Walmart famously announced last week that they expect to raise prices on some of their goods. They're going to try to work with their suppliers to minimize that impact. But they also said that they want to continue importing some of those Chinese goods so as to not to break their relationships with their long-standing suppliers. I've heard different companies announcing different types of strategies, but do you think this is a common strategy that prices will rise, or are they sort of charting their own path here?
Yeah, I think it's a common strategy that prices rise, right? And really, the challenge is, as I just touched on a second ago, is that retailers have thin margins and they can't absorb a 30% cost, right? So that's why the CEOs of Walmart and Target warned of empty shelves when we were at the 145% rate. It's before the de-escalation. So while companies can go and shift sourcing to other countries, it takes time. And unfortunately, there's no safe bet because of policy uncertainty. China's in the spotlight today, but the reciprocal tariffs, if they come back in July when that 90 days expires, countries like Vietnam and Cambodia will revert back to these, 46 to 49% tariff rates, right? Which are higher than the China's 30% right now, right? And so this kind of puts a freeze on making many of the alternate sourcing decisions. But uncertainty is also why companies like Walmart are continuing to buy, from their Chinese suppliers to not lose the relationships with that they've had for a long time, and because no one knows how long this trade war is going to last. And a lot of people saw it as a negotiating tool, so thought it would be short-lived. And maybe to the backing down from the triple-digit rates, perhaps that goes and signals a softening position. It's hard to know, right? And it's hard to know where things will be tomorrow, let alone next month or next quarter or next year. So the pragmatic decision for companies is to keep sourcing from their long-term suppliers because of the turmoil might blow over in a few months. And it's hard to make those other shifts for all those reasons we just talked about. Now, of course, one last thing on Walmart and for them in particular is there aren't many suppliers around the world that can meet the kind of volumes at that scale. So Walmart's in a particular case, but overall, I think that's what we're going to be seeing.
And of course, right before the tariffs were announced in the fall of the year, people anticipating tariffs, it brought a huge surge of products that were coming in as imports into the United States. In this 90-day period, do we expect to see a lot of the same as people are preparing for back to school and holiday seasons?
Yeah, I expect we'll see another surge in around 20 days from now when the ports of Long Island and Long Beach, start receiving all the stuff that is starting to be shipped across. And the first items to come are going to be those that are in ready to ship inventories, right? So stock that either couldn't get out before the 145 barrier was lifted, or from factories that build products for other markets where they can go and redirect some back to the US. So that's inventory on hand. Then the next one is standard goods where productions could come online, relatively quickly. But the really hard ones to get are going to be more complex items with longer lead times or new products that require new tooling, right? And so for these ones, that lead time is going to be long enough that you're probably going to be out of luck and the window's going to close, right? So but even at 30%, it's risky, right? Because will consumers absorb these costs? But companies are acting now because 30% is in the realm of something workable, right? At 145%, it was a non-starter.
When the pause in tariff ends, it will be right in the midst of people receiving products for holiday shipments. What's the holiday going to look like in this point, do you think? And what are there particular commodities that will be most affected by some of the tariffs that we may be seeing?
Yeah, I think, things in general will be more expensive. And second, you may not be able to go and find certain items, right? So if you think of, we're back to school and the holiday side, with back to school, the staples are going to be available, but they're going to be at a higher cost. So think pencils, clothing, shoes, electronics, right? Walmart's already, announced they were increasing the price at the end of this month, and I expect that from other retailers. But for other more specialized goods, maybe like, musical instruments for your band class or maybe football equipment for sports, these tend to have longer manufacturing times and they don't have as large inventories. And, since a lot of orders were held back for uncertainty, it's going to be harder to find those kinds of items. And it's going to be a similar kind of thing for story for holiday shopping, right? But we're a little better off from a timing perspective because they got a little more runway than the back to school offerings. And if things like toys and games, sports equipment, apparel and footwear, those kinds of things are at risk if the orders didn't get put in early enough. But there's this mad rush going on to get all the goods here before the August deadline closes. And I think in overall, everything is going to be more expensive because even at 30%, retailers can't absorb all the costs, so will be passed through to the consumers, which means that, households will have something under the tree, but it's probably going to be a little bit more of a grinchy holiday season than in the past.
So, how do you think all this will resolve with these trade wars? Will we find deals? You already mentioned that you think things will cost more. Will companies try to actually source more locally?
Well, I guess, David, my crystal ball is a little fuzzy here, right? And it goes back to part of what the objectives of the tariffs were in the first place. Is it to bring manufacturing back to America, to raise revenue for projects like tax cuts, to put pressure on foreign nations to make 90 deals in 90 days? Each of these objectives is at odds with one another. But with the 90-day reprieve, the question is this a signal that there's a softening in the position of tariffs and that the luster of tariffs is starting to wear off? I guess time will tell whether there's going to be a deal and how that's going to all go and sort out. But my crystal ball is a little fuzzy on that. But will countries try to go and source more locally? Yes, where it makes sense and where it's possible. But many commodities or products, they're not available in the US, right? Like coffee or cocoa, right? They don't grow in the US. And cobalt, for example, which is really important for batteries and superalloys. America has less than 1% of cobalt reserves. And even textiles, which we can make, but don't have the right labor force that wants these jobs. So that's part of the challenge too. And then, of course, all this will take time, just like the diversification efforts that followed the pandemic. It takes years to go and rewire supply chains.
Right. And the complexity there will remain. It's just something that we have to deal with.
Exactly.
We've been talking with John Lash. He's the Group Vice President of Strategy for E2open. John, we really appreciate your insights with us and joining us today.
Great. Thank you, David. Always appreciate it.
Now let's take a look at some of the other supply chain news from the week. And Ben, of course, we were just talking about the tariff pause, and you also have been looking at how shippers are planning their next 90 days. What are you hearing?
Yeah, that's right, Dave. I looked a little bit into the timing of exactly how this is going to play out because we're heading into Memorial Day weekend, Memorial Day coming up this long weekend. And these coming summer weeks are typically when retailers really stock up for some of those big peaks, back to school in the fall, and of course the winter holiday peak in the Christmas. Trying to match that up with this tariff disruption that our guest was just talking about. It is raising a lot of questions. I did read a report from a company called Freightos this week, and they pointed out, of course, that no nations except for the UK have yet announced permanent trade deals to try to extend the tariff pauses to the extent that maybe they're a negotiating tool. So without new deals, those original terms could snap back into effect at the expiration dates that John was talking about, the July and in August. Another question is what the expiration dates themselves mean really specifically. Fredo said that the White House policy is actually a little unclear about whether to be exempt from the tariffs at that point, goods need to arrive on the U.S. shore by the deadline, or if they merely need to have been loaded onto the ship at their point of origin by the deadline. The difference is significant because ocean shipments from the Far East would have to depart those foreign shores in the next week or two to arrive in the U.S. before July 9th.
Yes, that does make planning very difficult. What else are you hearing in the market? How are shippers and carriers trying to react and actually adjust their supply chains for all of this?
Right, a lot of adjustment. I read a different report from Everstream Analytics that they provide consulting on supply chain risk management. They noted, as we touched on, that there's a large increase in China to U.S. shipments that are expected during this pause period. And they also talked about, as John had mentioned, the potential for increased port congestion, therefore. They named specific ports like ports of Los Angeles, Long Beach on the west and Boston on the East Coast. And if and when that happens, it's related to a term that we all got to know during pandemic and that John just mentioned as well, called the bullwhip effect, since a lot of businesses who may have frozen imports in April are now rushing their shipments to catch up. And that creates a compressed early peak season that will likely cause that summer congestion when it plays out. It's like an accordion going back and forth, to mix metaphors, because as these policies keep on going back and forth, so do the actual physical trade flows.
Well, as we always say, supply chains work best with some degree of certainty, and they're getting anything but certainty now. So it's a bit unpredictable to know what to expect this summer.
That's the truth. It'll keep us on our toes.
Thank you, Ben.
Glad to.
And Victoria, you wrote this week about how the supply chain industry is seeing growth in flexible work roles. What kind of roles are we talking about, and how are they changing?
Yeah, Dave, that's right. So, a few different roles, but let me give you a bit of background first. I came across a report on this topic, and it has to do with frontline workers. Those are people who perform essential duties that directly affect the public or core operations of an organization. We became very familiar with the term during the pandemic, and logistics workers comprise a big part of that demographic, of course. So the report is based on a survey by two companies, Resume Now, which is a resume building service, and a company called Talroo, which is a frontline workforce hiring company. They released the results in their Frontline Remote Work Trends 2025 report. And what they found is that while many workers in general are facing return to office mandate these days, we hear that a lot, I think, frontline workers in some industries, including logistics, are seeing an increase in opportunities to work from home. Among the frontline workers in all industries that they looked at, they found that remote eligible roles were up 9% year over year. And the top frontline industries for remote jobs included healthcare, warehousing and logistics, and retail. In warehousing and logistics specifically, they found that remote job opportunities have doubled since 2022, and they jumped by 25% from the fourth quarter of 2024 through the first quarter of this year. And to answer your specific question, the top remote roles in warehousing logistics include freight broker, customs operations, and sales executive positions.
Well, those are some pretty sizable increases, Victoria. What's driving the trend?
Well, the short answer is technology. The survey found that the use of digital tools, automation, and upskilling of employees are really what's driving this. Specifically, more companies are using cloud-based systems that allow freight brokers and logistics coordinators to manage shipments remotely. They're also using predictive analytics tools that allow remote workers to optimize inventory and shipping routes. And organizations are also using automated communication platforms that can help remote teams coordinate operations across multiple locations. In addition to that, the report noted that tech-savvy candidates are in the best position to take advantage of the growth in remote frontline jobs, and that makes perfect sense. And that's placing a greater emphasis on the need for companies to invest in efforts to help workers achieve those digital skills. So a lot of training in that regard, and employees just getting more tech savvy.
Right. And we regularly write about the need for companies to digitally transform their operations, and that includes their workforce as well. They need to have the digital skills to move them and their companies forward.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Victoria.
You're welcome.
We encourage listeners to go to dcvelocity.com for more on these and other supply chain stories. Also, check out the podcast notes section for some direct links to read more about the topics that we discussed today. And we'd like to thank John Lash of e2open for being our guest. We welcome your comments on this topic and our other stories. You can email us at podcast@agilebme.com. We also encourage you to subscribe to Logistics Matters at your favorite podcast platform. Our new episodes are uploaded on Fridays. And a reminder that Logistics Matters is sponsored by Cardex. AutoStore, empowered by Cardex, offers the fastest order fulfillment system per square foot. Cardex's intuitive picking assistant and Fulfill X software optimize AutoStore, providing customers with unmatched storage density, inventory accuracy, and operator efficiency for maximum ROI. When you think AutoStore, think Cardex. Find out more at cardex.com. We'll be back again next week with another edition of Logistics Matters. Be sure to join us. Until then, have a great holiday weekend.